Hello there, my friends. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where today my special guest is national security expert and analyst, host of a great new podcast, In the Room. Peter Bergen joins me. That conversation begins at about 11 minutes in. But first, just want to give you a little bit of news and notes, starting with the latter. Thank you very much for all of the birthday wishes and generous gifts to my Venmo. Very nice. Appreciate that. All of you offering the extra birthday bonus. Very kind. And thank you for all of your birthday wishes and notes and comments. Very, very grateful to be a part of this community and always trying to give back to you in every possible way. In addition to a 5 to 6 day a week episode of this here podcast. Got lucky on Halloween here in the Northeast. It was a beautiful day. It was crisp autumn day, as I like to say, the 31st, and I spent all of it outside and really enjoyed my birthday. Did a nice journal entry, meditation, went for a long run, did some reading, talked to a few of my friends, my mom and my dad. Ava called me. We had a nice chat. It was really a wonderful day. I took it totally off the screens, and I'm very grateful for your support that allows me to do that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, well, here's a bunch of news stories. I will just read off to you in a couple of news clips. Let's go to the Middle East first, where the Rafah border crossing opened for the first time since Israel imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip. Israeli forces launched their second strike on Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp in 2 days. The Israeli military, said they killed a Hamas commander. They better have, because Palestinians called it a massacre. And now the United Nations human rights officials are saying the operation could be a war crime there at that refugee camp. 2 strikes in 2 days. A Hamas official said, we will repeat October 7th again and again. So that's no good. But if Israel wants American support, well, we are going to have to pay more in taxes, thanks to House Republicans' plan to fund a $14 billion in emergency aid for Israel, with cuts to the IRS that would end up costing us $26 billion over 10 years. So that's the deal as of now. Speaking of those House Republicans, several of them led a push to expel George Santos, but it failed last night because it was only 23 Republicans voting for that. The embattled lawmakers facing now criminal charges. Of course, he says he's innocent, but we say he's a punchline. The Daily Beast is reporting newly elected Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, does not have a bank account, which is disconcerting because that means he could be at risk of not having any money, which means he could be at even higher risk of being exploited. It's the whole thing. Check it out over at the Daily Beast. The Federal Reserve, for their part, the chairman of the Fed, announced interest rates would be left unchanged at a 22-year high for the second straight policy meeting. The Biden administration is set to spend $1.3 billion to build 3 large electrical transmission lines across 6 states to upgrade the nation's power grid. Talked about that with David Roberts last week. Don Jr. was on the stand yesterday in a Manhattan court. He testified his memory was fuzzy. He never worked on the key documents in his father's civil fraud trial. Sure. Bad news for infant mortality rates, up 3% last year, the largest increase in 2 decades. In the state of Oregon, Portland teachers in the largest school district have gone on strike over class sizes, pay, and lack of resources. Schools closed for 45,000 students in the first ever walkout in Portland School District. And finally, Bob Knight, legendary Indiana basketball coach and angriest man alive, apparently, dead at age 83. I mean, he's known for his temper tantrums, which is a weird thing to be known for. You know, maybe he was just passionate. All right, those are your headlines. Now to some sound clips. I think I'm going to make that the new format of the show. I'm going to try that for the next week or so. Bunch of headlines, then sound, then the interview. Intro, headlines, sound, interview. That's the show. All right, we'll try that. Now, let's start here with a little clip from Liz Cheney. She was on the University of Virginia podcast with Larry Sabato. Politics is everything. And she said the new House Speaker is dangerous. Here's her reasons in their exclusive interview.
One of the reasons why somebody like Mike Johnson is dangerous, because when you have elected Republicans who know better, elected Republicans who know the truth, but yet will go along with the efforts to undermine our republic, the efforts, frankly, that Donald Trump undertook to overturn the election. In order for the party and therefore the country to move away from Donald Trump, he's got to be defeated. But that means that people who know better have to recognize the stakes. They have to recognize that this isn't a game. This isn't politics as usual. We're dealing with somebody who, if he were elected to another term, would most assuredly begin the process very quickly of attempting to consolidate power and, frankly, undo the institutions that protect our freedom.
Another stark warning from the former Congresswoman. I think if Trump were reelected, he would send a Hellfire missile into the Cheney home. Pretty sure he would order that on day one. She's got to be personally frightened about her own security if he does get reelected, which I do not think he will. Well, here is Congressman Max Miller. He's a Republican. He's from Ohio. He's one of two Jewish House Republicans, and he tore into anti-Semitism in both sides of the aisle when talking to CNN's Manu Raju about upcoming votes to censure members. Here is Congressman Max Miller.
I called for George Santos's expulsion at the very beginning of the year, and, I'm a man of my word. I'm not backing away. I'm a Republican who likes to hold other Republicans accountable when they do nasty things, but it is a very personal issue that I have with him, and what I can tell you is he broke the law, and I will be voting yes. If we want to call balls and strikes, members of both parties have said anti-Semitic remarks. They have. Marjorie Taylor Greene has said anti-Semitic remarks. Rashida Tlaib has said anti-Semitic remarks. I'm going to call it out on both sides of the aisle. I'm sick of it.
All right, he's sick of it. We'll hold him to that, calling it out on both sides of the aisle. You know who else is sick of it? Oh, Lindsey Graham is really sick of it. I've got a clip of him for you. He is very upset with House Republicans' proposal to link Israeli funding aid with cutting funding to the IRS.
I side with Israel, and I want to get them as much money as they need as quick as they can get it. So to the House. I understand we need to start paying for things around here. I get that. But this is truly an emergency, and I don't think we've ever offset an emergency aid before. When we have a disaster, when there's a hurricane that hits South Carolina, we don't have pay-fors because it's an emergency. What I don't want to happen is that the support for Israel become partisan, right? I think there's probably 400 votes in the House to support Israel. Now, when you start putting things like pay-fors on the table, then you break that coalition apart.
So
that's what I worry about.
Got to pay for Israel. Israel, how the hell pronounces it that way? And let's do one more. How about one more Republican? Because this clip went pretty viral yesterday. This is Republican Congressman Brian Mast, who's got some pretty odious views on things, most things, I would say. And yesterday, well, he said this.
As a whole, I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians, as is frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II.
Oh, real bad. What a racist moron. His actual concern for Israel only extends as far as his anti-Semitic beliefs in the rapture is one tweet I saw about this. Another, I rarely use the word evil, but Brian Mast is an evil piece of shit. Wow. Absolutely vile commentary from the Republican congressman from Florida, saying there's no distinction between Hamas and Palestinian civilians, who he then compared to Nazis. All right, I think we're going to need a palate cleanser after all of that. So maybe I'll add one more element to the new format of the first part of the show. Intro, headlines, sound, and then a joke from some great comedian. Here's Stephen Colbert, Late Show, on CBS talking about the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
Before yesterday, Mike Johnson had very little name recognition, except for the fact that he has America's most generic name. Now, I need your participation here. I want you to clap in here if you know someone named Mike or Michael Johnson. Any of those Mike Johnsons would be a better Speaker of the House. But Republicans are doing their best to convince us that their only choice was the right choice. Texas Representative Pat Fallon said this of Johnson.
I would really put him in a mold of Ronald Reagan. I know that's saying a lot. He's shorter than the president.
Yes. And that's the thing everyone associates with Reagan. His height. Who can forget this famous moment?
Mr. Gorbachev, I can dunk.
It's true. It's true. Right top of the key. Matt Gaetz also had some words of praise for Johnson.
He's a Louisiana man, and we're going to Bayou hours. So people are actually going to have to work on Mondays and Fridays.
Yo, it's exciting to have the first Bayou speaker. Hey, how you all are? Just gonna drain the swamp, gonna get right down on them gators and pull about in a perubo, lazy le bon ton jambalaya, I guarantee.
All right, there you go. On behalf of all my friends over at The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And now let's get to my very special guest. Well done, produced, informative news podcast called In the Room with Peter Bergen, an Audible original, and it's great. I've listened to about half the episodes and the last 4, which are so interesting and informative. He did an episode about mass shooting, asking the question, can the next mass shooting be prevented? Interviewed several experts there, as he does with all of his episodes. He has usually 2 or 3 very good analysts and experts on, which make the podcast so much more journalistically ethical, in my opinion. He also did a recent episode asking the question, how does Russian propaganda machine work? And he had on historian Andrew Roberts and General David Petraeus on to discuss the Middle East conflict, asking the question, can a general and a military historian say Israel-Hamas war is the most challenging conflict since 1945, or more of a statement, I guess. Peter Bergen, in his bio, it reads, has been chasing great stories around the globe for his entire career. Notably, in 1997, he was the producer of Osama bin Laden's first American television interview in a hideout in Tora Bora, and has traveled to Afghanistan many times since then to cover al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the U.S. military intervention. He's currently CNN's national security analyst, a documentary producer, think tank executive, and the author or editor of 10 books, 3 of which were New York Times bestsellers, and 4 of which were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. You can read more about him at peterbergen.com. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, the host of In the Room with Peter Bergen. It's guess who? Peter Bergen. All right, there he is, Peter Bergen. Peter, thank you so much for joining me again. Great to see you, and great work on your podcast, man. I would say your best work ever, and I've been following your work for a long time.
Well, thank you, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
It's different than television journalism and writing books and obviously your think tank work. But I love the way that you're doing this podcast with all of these experts. Explain to people a little bit about what you do.
Well, it's a pretty highly produced podcast in the sense that it's multiple voices, good sound design, well produced. They're all sort of roughly 40-minute episodes, and once a week. So it's a fair amount of work. We have a very strong production team to make sure that we kind of are able to maintain the pretty high level.
Well, you're maintaining a very high level, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it. Before we get into your most recent episodes, I think I just listened to like 5 of them in preparation, talking to you. It's so much good, informative, relevant information. I want to just ask you, as we watch what is happening to violence in the Middle East, it seems almost unprecedented in our lifetimes, this specific conflict, how bad it's gotten. And so many people are comparing it to after 9/11 and what America's reaction was. President Biden basically, in a kind of unprecedented moment in a speech, said, don't overreact. And now it seems that Israel may do just that. It's hard to analyze. But I want to ask you what you think of those kinds of comparisons.
Well, I mean, it was a surprise attack. So was Pearl Harbor. Obviously, there were kind of isolationists in the United States who didn't want to get into the war. Pearl Harbor changed everything for the United States. And 9/11 obviously was a hinge event in American history. And October 7th is a hinge event in Israeli history. So from that point of view, they're similar. Obviously, there are also differences. I mean, after 9/11, the United States responded by occupying Afghanistan and destroying much of al-Qaeda. Israel, Gaza is part of Israel, even though it's, governed by Hamas. The analogies begin to break down, I think, pretty quickly because the conflicts. I mean, it was interesting that Biden said, don't make the same mistakes that we made after 9/11, which was obviously we started the planning for the Iraq war started, literally within the next weekend. I mean, there were discussions at Camp David about the need to take out Saddam Hussein. So that was obviously a big error. And
that was an aim for a certain group, the Project for a New American Century, for a long, long time. It wasn't like it came out of just that, right?
Right. And I mean, the people who are advocating for it have been wanting to, Paul Wolfowitz, who was the number 2 at defense, and others have been advocating, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein for a long time. So 9/11 kind of provided an opportunity by linking Saddam to 9/11, even though he had nothing to do with it. That was part of the case that was made to go to war. So, but, Pete, in general, I think just to sort of zoom out even further, I mean, war is a very uncertain enterprise. And, this war in Gaza is could go on for a long time. And there are lots of things that, can affect that, whether it's international pressure on Israel to dial back, which Israel doesn't want to right now. And the Israeli population certainly wants Hamas to be more or less taken out of business. But then, will we start seeing Israeli soldier casualties mount? Will that kind of change the domestic politics in Israel? Quite possibly.
In your most recent episode that just dropped, title of which is "A General and a Military Historian Say Israel-Hamas War is Most Challenging Conflict Since 1945. You talked to General David Petraeus and Andrew Roberts, who I guess have a new book out, which I'm now interested in reading. But I feel like the 9/11 analogy is less congruent to the Iraq analogy, because there's a moment in that interview where Petraeus talks about what happened when the American forces captured the city of Najaf is it the American forces during the battle in Iraq, right?
Yeah. So, David Petraeus, General Petraeus, and Lord Andrew Roberts have written this quite good book called Conflict. They look at every kind of significant conflict between World War II and Ukraine. The book came out just as the Gaza war started. But Petraeus tells the story when he took Najaf, which is a half a million people city in Iraq. He called his boss and he said, "The good news is I've taken Najaf. The bad news is I've taken Najaf." So what happens the day after you take a city or you win some kind of military victory is very important. And right now, we're hearing almost nothing about what the day after in Gaza is going to look like. I can tell you what it's going to look like physically based on conversations with multiple urban warfare experts. And, it's going to be, 70, 80, 90%. Every building is going to be either damaged or destroyed. Based on when we look at when ISIS was dug into Mosul, which is the second biggest city in Iraq, it took 9 months to basically defeat them. That was with U.S. military help on the ground, and in the air, 100,000 Iraqi security forces, and Mosul was mostly destroyed. And that's following the laws of war. Following the laws of war doesn't mean you're going to not have civilian casualties. So it's anyway. Just to pick up on what you said, Pete. The fact that Petraeus and Roberts, who's a very eminent military historian, both said this is the most complex kind of conflict since World War II that they've looked at, and they've just looked at a bunch of them for this book.
Yeah.
I think speaks for itself, because there are so many different clocks that are running. There's the Israeli domestic political clock where people want, Hamas to be destroyed. There's the international political clock where a lot of countries are saying to Israel, you've got to stop. And then there's the hostage negotiation clock. I mean, I know something about that because I've been on the board of the Foley Foundation that is involved in trying to get Americans rescued and get Americans home. Hostage negotiations are really complicated, even in a situation where there isn't a real war going on. Kind of these negotiations can be very complicated. So the whole thing is, it's not my view or your view. It's that this is such a complicated situation. It's, Dave Petraeus and Lord Andrew Roberts, who both as practitioners or historians of warfare investigated or practiced a lot of war. So this is very complicated.
Yeah, very, very well said. Very complicated. The history, religion, land, and so many players around the region and the world. It seems like the world got a lot hotter, Peter Bergen, because you already had a pretty horrifying war happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I wonder, how we can tie in your episode talking about Russian propaganda machine and how that has informed or and disinformed the Russians and the rest of the world on that conflict. But man, it seems like things are getting worse in terms of violence and wars.
Yeah, I mean, this is not World War III or anything close, or World War I or World War II. But I mean, clearly, I mean, what I think is, I mean, there were reports today that the Houthis in Yemen, who are supported by Iran, had sent missiles in the direction of the Israeli port of Eilat, and the fact that the Houthi rebels don't have the capacity to build missiles that can go a really long way, and they're supplied by Iran, they're backed by Iran. And we've also had, quite a number of reports of rockets being sent at U.S. military installations in Iraq and Syria. There are 900 American troops in Syria. There are 2,500 American troops in Iraq. There are a bunch of Iranian military proxies in both countries, and Iranian kind of, it's regular Iranian soldiers in Syria. So, they're certainly going to kind of up the pressure on the United States and also on Israel, these Iranian proxies. Will it get to a much wider war? We can only hope not. And
I want to ask you, based on what you just said there, I think the episode, there's a couple I think I was most fascinated with. All of it is really great, everything you're doing. But early October, you dropped this episode about the war in Iraq, and it's titled "The War That Americans Forgot, Iraqis Can't," and Iran won, most importantly. Yeah. And I think about that all the time. Every time it comes up, I thought about it I thought about it at the beginning, because there were so many smart people talking about the history of Iran and Iraq and the makeup of Iraq, Sunni Shia Kurd, and simply that when you got rid of Saddam, the very, very possible and highly likely outcome would be that Iran somehow gained more power in the region between those two countries and potentially in the world without Saddam. And that point gets made a few different ways. Talk to us about why that's so important now, relevant to what you just said about how Iran has been threatening and supporting those who threaten Israel.
Well, if you look at the map of the Middle East, Iran, Lebanon in the north, Hezbollah is basically an arm of the Iranian government. Right. And then go 1,500 miles south, the Houthi rebels in Yemen are supplied and supported by Iran. Right. Obviously in Iraq, by the way, the conclusion that Iran won the Iraq war is not my conclusion. It is a conclusion of the official U.S. Army history of the Iraq war, which is the only official American history of the war that has been published. And so this is a bunch of U.S. Army historians led by Colonel Joel Rayburn, who's actually an old friend of mine and a very impressive historian. And they interviewed everybody, and they had they declassified 30,000 pages of documents, and that's their conclusion.
Crazy.
And if you look at, I was in Iraq earlier this year, and Iran, it's not like Iraq is not controlled by Iran, but Iran has a great deal of influence, and some of that is pretty natural. I mean, they're both Shia majority states. The most sacred sites of Shia Islam are actually in Iraq, not in Iran. And so some influence is to be expected, but there's clearly much more than just influence. Iran plays a very big role in the Iraqi security services, Iranian-backed militias. So Iran has done, pretty well over the last many years in terms of, it's trying to influence the region. And
we can trace a lot of it back, though, to the invasion.
Completely. I mean, there was a reason why the United States was sort of somewhat allied with Saddam for many years, which was that they were. You remember the famous picture of Donald Rumsfeld greeting Saddam Hussein? That was a time when the United States was giving Iraq intelligence about Iranian positions. Right. During the Iran-Iraq war. So
selling them weapons. I remember people used to talk about Rumsfeld has the receipts.
So we supported Iraq during the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq war.
It matters. History matters so much, but that's a great episode. You talked to, I think, maybe 3 very, very smart women in that episode. And we learn about, it's just so crazy to think that there's a lot of young men and women, Iraqi citizens alive today that weren't alive when Saddam was there. And there's this kind of question. There's so much corruption there you talk about. And there's this question of maybe they want a strong man, authoritarian, and it just makes you think about, if only you knew what it was like, because you also went in the torture rooms. Really fascinating and important episode. Of all of them, I think to me that might be, although I've got to ask you about a couple of more. So if you want to say another word about what that that episode means to
Pete. I mean, I went inside what used to be a Saddam prison in northern Iraq. And one thing that was pretty striking, I mean, obviously Saddam tortured and killed thousands of people in this one prison alone. It was in Kurdish Iraq. But, what I hadn't expected was they also have exhibits about ISIS in this prison. There used to be a prison that's been turned into a museum. Because, of course, ISIS controlled that part of Iraq at one point and was killing, lots of people. And so, you think about the history of Iraq, last 20 years. I mean, the U.S. invasion, civil war, then ISIS. It's been pretty rough. And so, the reason, Iraq is still as you mentioned, there's a lot of corruption. There is an elected government. There is a whole generation who doesn't remember Saddam, because he was actually found in 20 years ago. Next month is when he was found in that spider hole.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And of course, at the time, people thought, well, we found Saddam, game over.
Right.
And that's always, this is one of the, it turned out to be that was completely wrong.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, and I always think of that video of the statue of Saddam being torn down as one benchmark, Saddam being found as another benchmark. The kind of erasure of him created a vacuum, which, again, was highly predicted, including by, I think, Dick Cheney, who said if we invaded Iraq and went all the way in the Gulf War, Iraq would have broken into pieces. And then years later, when he was the vice president, that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, well, luckily Iraq is not, is still in one piece. Look, Iraq has oil, that's a really good thing. But it
also, it makes them so rich.
Yeah, I mean, certainly they have resources. The problem that they face, which is really existential, is climate change. I mean, Baghdad is, during the summer, it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit as a regular matter. And you're seeing a lot of climate refugees in Iraq coming in from the rural areas into the cities because they can't grow their crops. And, that story has been played out, across the region and will likely only get worse.
So let me go from there, if I can, make a big leap to, maybe not such a big leap, to another episode of yours, which you did about mass shootings in America. Because let me just, to bridge it to there, I wonder how much you think about the foreign jihadist threat, if you will, the Al-Qaedas of the world. Republican congressmen and right-wing pundits are warning that they're coming across the southern border, and that's a real concern. My concern, and I think about the entire threat matrix and try to talk about it and try to be rational about what is the biggest, in this case, terrorist threat, would be the domestic one. The ubiquity of firearms in America, how many people you can kill. And I wonder, as we begin to talk about that really important episode you did researching mass shootings, how worried or how much you think about or how serious those threats are of foreign jihadists, and maybe not versus domestic terrorists, but just thoughts around it all.
Well, I take it foreign terrorists coming into the United States is a non-problem. I mean, it just is. And certainly coming across the border is even less so. The only example I can think of where that happened was a terrorist called Ahmed Rassam crossed the Canadian border into the United States in 1999. He had a plan to basically blow up a bomb at Los Angeles International Airport during the Christmas holiday season, which would have been really bad. Luckily, he was arrested at the border. But terrorists, basically, they believe in something called air travel. And, when we've seen foreign terrorists kind of coming into the United States, they've come by plane, not over the southern border. I mean, Who wants to cross the Darien Gap, which is one of the most dangerous places in the world, and then kind of come all the way up? It doesn't make any sense. And it hasn't happened. And I'm not saying it can't happen, but it hasn't happened. And so since 9/11, the only foreign terrorist who attacked that was being successfully carried out in the United States was by a Saudi military officer who obviously arrived here on a flight. And he killed 3 U.S. sailors at the Pensacola, Florida Naval Air Station. But otherwise, it's people here in the United States. It's pretty hard now to get into the United States.
Just to be clear, you're saying the threat of a foreign terrorist coming across the border is low versus...
I think it's very low. I mean, and it's not an opinion. It hasn't happened.
Yeah, right. Fair enough.
It's not impossible. Things can happen. But the foreign terrorists that we have seen in the United States have come by, they take planes just like everybody else. They don't spend, a year crossing the Darien Gap and going all the way through Guatemala and Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what we do see are, people who are here already, which is Americans, naturalized or second generation, getting radicalized, whether they're getting radicalized by jihadi ideas or by right-wing terrorist, right-wing extremist ideas. And we've just seen a series of warnings from the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, and also and others saying that the Gaza conflict is sort of really radicalizing. And we saw an Islamophobic terrorist kill a 6-year-old child who happened to be from a Palestinian family.
Yeah, Illinois.
We've seen a bunch of anti-Semitic incidents in this country, and so the concern right now is that the Gaza conflict will come. Well, what they've actually said, and I don't know, it's hard to make the judgment how true this is, but that the Gaza conflict is almost sort of like a ISIS-style incitement to violence for people on either side of the conflict, and we've already seen one 6-year-old child being murdered as a result of this.
And we've heard so many threats, violent threats. The FBI just arrested a Cornell student who had made threats, and hard to know, how serious these threats are, but vandalism and so much more. So, yeah, really, really good points. Yeah, brings us to this episode. Can the next mass shooting be prevented? Wow, this was fascinating, Bergen. You go back to Columbine. You introduced us to the behavioral analysis unit, which you painted the picture. I appreciated a small nugget where you said a small descriptive, brown building, because I always look at buildings where I don't know what they're in, and I think they're government agents because I don't believe in any conspiracy theories, and it makes me entertained. But tell us about this episode. Well, how did you choose, to cover this issue?
Well, I've been at the behavioral analysis unit previously when I was digging into the question of why do Americans, become jihadist terrorists. And it was a real eye-opener for me. And so when we did, mass shootings is unfortunately a very common event in the United States, not on the scale of what we just saw in Lewiston, Maine, where 18 people were killed. We haven't seen something that big since Uvalde a year and a half ago. But, we knew that, that mass shootings are really an issue. And so there's a whole kind of discipline of threat management that has emerged in the last 20 plus years. Interestingly, it started in Hollywood. Gavin DeBecker, who's basically runs he guards a lot of stars. He developed kind of a matrix about how do you because there are lots of threats, but how do you sort of separate the signals from the noise and the wheat from the chaff? And so he developed a system which really looked at he didn't care about motivation, but it was more about what people's actions are. And so when you look at a mass shooter or any kind of murderer who premeditated, they tend to follow the same pathway. They tend to have, it starts with a grievance. We all have grievances, but most of us just get over them. This mass shooter, would-be mass shooter, isn't able to get rid of this grievance. It becomes just, kind of takes over his mind. And by the way, 98% of mass shooters are male. So
yeah.
And that ideation, then becomes like, well, what am I going to do about this? And thinking about violence as a solution, and then maybe doing some research into kind of either the tactics, the weapons, maybe looking at other mass shootings to see what worked and what didn't work. Maybe doing a rehearsal and a dry run, and finally, the attack itself. And so this pathway to violence is pretty well known amongst the FBI. It's pretty well known amongst psychologists who study mass shooters, etc. And so the behavioral analysis unit will often work with law enforcement, local law enforcement. Local law enforcement usually does a pretty good job of arresting criminals, but they may not know how to handle a would-be mass shooter who may have no criminal record at all, may have no known history of violence. How do you divert this person is an interesting question. And you also don't want to divert them. You don't want to intervene in a way that makes the situation worse. But the behavioral unit folks that we spoke to said that they get 150 referrals. They used to get 150 referrals a year from local law enforcement. Now they get 350, and they think they've stopped quite a number of mass shooters from going down this pathway. But if you look at the case in Lewiston, Maine, clearly there were a ton of, very big red flags about him, and yet he was still able to carry out this attack. So it's also obviously, it's a lot easier to say, well, the warning signs were missed after the attack. And also, by the way, if you stop an attack, it's hard to measure, because like nothing happens, right?
Yeah, you're proving a negative, and you come to the conclusion, so does your experts, that access to firearms is the issue that separates us from most of the rest of the world. So that seems obvious, though obviously still too controversial in America. But Peter, I mean, there's this point about they almost always have a grievance, which I thought was fascinating. And then this specific unit of law enforcement within the FBI, she said, we have to be careful that we don't become the grievance, which I thought was really important, because the expert you're talking to and all the experts and within the conversation is the question that's very important in America about the right to privacy and when law enforcement might somehow violate that in an effort to protect us. And we can have and should have, I think, that thoughtful debate. It sounds like they're having that debate. And if anything, the person you said says, listen, we don't even have the resources to do all those kinds of things that people think we're able to do.
Well, I think, this is a very thoughtful group of people, the behavioral analysis unit, and they don't, we asked, give us a case. Obviously there's confidentiality, but, Kerry Gibson, who runs the unit, said a case happened where a kid, teenager was fixating on school shootings. That became known to local law enforcement. The family wasn't really paying attention to this kid. A local sheriff went in and sort of started mentoring him, started taking him to mental health appointments, and eventually, nothing really happened. And the family involved had no idea that the FBI was in any way kind of advising local law enforcement about what to do. But it's tough. I mean, one of the people the amazing woman that we interviewed in the episode, she found that her son was making notes in his notebook about carrying out a school shooting, potentially also killing his mother, and also absconding with two young children and dropping them dropping them somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so, for a mother, that's a very hard choice. What do you do? And so her choice, and she talks about it publicly, was to inform local law enforcement, he spent time in detention, in juvenile detention. And that's a very hard decision for a mother. On the other hand, an even harder one would be to do nothing and then find out that your son has carried out a school shooting and killed a bunch of people and is in the prison for the rest of his life. And she clearly made the right decision. But, I think, Pete, one thing that's very important about this particular point, and I knew this from looking into jihadist terrorists, but it's true in general, based on my discussions with the FBI. The people who know the most about sort of behavior that is worrisome are peers. The people who know the second most are family members. The people who know the third most are authority figures like priests or clerics or teachers. The people who know the least are strangers. But the strangers are the most likely to drop a dime on sort of suspicious behavior, but they don't know anything. Peers are the least likely to come forward with information, and they have the best information. So, and obviously family members may come forward or may not come forward. I mean, in the case of Nicole, this woman who she found her son,
right,
the writings, she came forward, but it's a tough one. It's a tough decision, of course, because particularly in the case where somebody may not have done anything yet, and they know, but anyway, the point is that if somebody is contemplating a mass shooting, the people, or an act of terrorism, the people who are most likely to know anything about it are peers.
Right.
And they're often the people who are least likely to drop a dime because they're buddies with this person, or they don't know, they're not really sure, or whatever. But
this is why it's such a really important point. I'm sorry I interrupted you there, but
no. I mean, it is an important point because, of course, also, people say dumb things all the time, and you're having weapons is not, as we say in the piece. I mean, there are more guns than people in the United States, so it's like having a weapon doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be violent, obviously. But Mary O'Toole, who the former FBI agent that we interviewed, who basically she did the first really big investigation into Columbine, which was sort of like, has become such a sort of important for people who carry out school shootings. They still really fixate on Columbine. But, she said, look, again and again, when I look at these cases, and she's been doing it for decades, it's like, access to weapons is the kind of you can't kill somebody with a penknife, or it's highly unlikely.
Yeah, it's not like people aren't emotionally disturbed, mentally ill, sociopathic in every country in the world.
Mass shootings are, happen in other countries. They're just exceptionally rare. I mean, I grew up in the UK, and I can still remember the Dunblane, Scotland school shooting because it was, so unusual.
Yeah.
Whereas here, we just kind of got used to it. And, it is a form of terrorism because, a lot of people don't want to go to theater, movie theater or whatever, because they're worried that they might get trapped. I mean, that's not normal in a mass shooting incident, or I don't want to be in a space where that's possible. And, so it's a great shame. And, sometimes, I mean, in the Lewiston, Maine case, the system really failed because this guy clearly had mental issues, and people were, there were a lot of people, different points along the way that people said, something's wrong with this guy. And yet somehow he was able to retain his weapons and carry out this attack.
Yeah, the whole system on the way, I talk about this with people all the time, Peter, but the whole system on the way to even getting a gun is flawed because there are so many things you can do, background checks, red flag laws, but even those laws are controversial to too many people. I guess I'll categorize them on the right, the gun rights people, if you will. So
my in-laws in Louisiana do not hunt with AR-15s. An AR-15 is basically an M6. It's a civilian version of the M16 rifle.
Yeah.
And what is it designed to do? It's designed to kill people. It doesn't really have any other design.
Yeah.
And so the fact that, and not all mass shootings, by the way, are conducted with AR-15s, but quite a lot are. You obviously can kill a lot of people quickly. Yeah. And so the fact that these weapons are widely available, it doesn't make any sense to me. And particularly they belong inside gun ranges.
Yeah.
There isn't really, I think, a place for AR-15s just to sort of be widely available to anybody who wants them.
No, there isn't. But, if you talk to anybody who knows a lot about guns, they'll talk about all kinds of other guns that are very similar. I mean, the bottom line is if you can shoot a whole bunch of bullets quickly, as fast as you can pull the trigger, a lot of these people are just, copying themselves because that gun is sexier to them or more attractive to them. But the bottom line is even if we could not do anything about the guns, just the idea of, and I think that's what this woman and these experts are doing, is creating their policies, laws, and incentives to prevent someone from getting those guns, turning them in. And it's fraught, but it works in a lot of different cases. As you mentioned, they do stop these people. They don't get any credit for it. It's, you don't want to destroy someone's life if they didn't commit a violent act, but we should be celebrated, thus giving incentive and supporting those policies when they do stop them.
Yeah. And as you sort of mentioned, when things don't happen, it's hard to measure, but, clearly the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit very strongly feels that you can prevent a mass shooting if you know what to look for. And some people may not be diverted off the pathway to violence. The FBI can intervene in a case or local law enforcement, and somebody can still decide to go and do something. But typically, if there is an intervention, most people will stop.
If there are awards for podcasts, investigative journalism, I hope that you get them because you just did a really good job. It was fascinating spending the whole morning listening to your last few episodes in preparation to talk to you. And I hope our listeners will.
I feel sorry for you. That was a lot of Peter Bergen to listen to.
Oh, Peter Bergen as the host of this podcast is my favorite Peter Bergen because it's all the good. It's all the good stuff. Yeah. I mean, come on. You know how you sound.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. Thanks for listening to them, and see you soon. Bye.
All right, there he goes. Peter Bergen. Sorry if that sounded a little disjointed at the end. I had to edit something out. We had a little bit of a personal conversation there at the end, and I had to just pull that out. But that was great, and Peter Bergen, really good. I love that podcast. Really enjoy it, and learned a lot from it. Got a lot of great perspectives, some great experts. Peter and his team do a great job. Go check it out. Let them know that you heard him here on the program so we can get him back. That's always helpful. Write a review on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, and follow me on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and wherever else. You got to post everywhere if you want to survive in this world of independent media. I'm very happy to have you supporting me. Go to standupwithpete.com to learn more. Email me, standupwithpete @gmail.com. Thank you very much, John Carroll, for all of the great music. As always, johncarroll.org to support him, and I will talk to you later or tomorrow right here on Stand Up. Tell your friends. Bye-bye.
We got to rise up, you got to stand up, you got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence, and even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense and you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.